Hi everyone, welcome back to the second of these three short videos about world building. Um, First of all, it's peak hay fever season in New York, so if you hear me uh, sneezing or sniffing or kind of smacking my lips, it's because I'm completely smothered by pollen. I've taken any antihistamine I can get my hands on, but I'm still suffering a bit. Blech. Okay, so in the first video, we saw how you need a big idea, a society changing idea to set up the world that you're going to write your science fiction in. The second of the three rules I suggest that you follow is, as you can see on the screen, a logical timeline and, most importantly, internal consistency. So, what do I actually mean by that? Well, again, let's look at some examples from contemporary fiction. This is The Expanse. Now, as I mentioned in the first video, The Expanse is a series set in the future when mankind has occupied the solar system. Now, they don't go into the timeline of that world in that much detail. There are scenes set on Earth and the Moon and out in the belt, and there are characters that discuss their background. But it's not a show that follows the expansion of mankind. It's just there. So their timeline is people go from the Earth to the Moon, to the Mars, out to the asteroid belt, and then finally to the protomolecule rings. So you can understand how there's a logical timeline there, and the opening credits are fantastic, and they explain this whole story. So that's what these three images are from. To the left, they show the Moon, then in the middle it shows Mars, and then to the right it shows the asteroid belt. So I think we can all understand how, let's say Elon Musk and SpaceX continue their work and then it scales up in the next 100 years, how this would make sense and would be a logical approach. So when characters refer back to the past, it's based upon solid foundations. Something a bit similar and simpler is, again, persons of interest. I use this as it's a show that maintained its consistency through all of its 5 seasons. And again, it was based upon a timeline that was internally consistent and logical. That being, there was 9/11, which then enabled the NSA to set up a surveillance program, which gave birth to an AI, gave birth to the machine that was able to watch every single person in America. Now, in this series, they did have flashbacks. They did go back and show the birth of the machine. Um, but right from the first episode to the last, it didn't deviate from this premise and this timeline. Again, internal consistency is really important. Now, one of the best science fiction movies of all time, whether you like it or not, you have to admit that Blade Runner's world building is sensational. And again, as it was based upon the text written by Philip K. Dick, I'd say the timeline has some more ambiguity in it and some more mysticism, maybe a bit deeper than some of the other things I've just looked at. But when you start off, you're in Los Angeles 2019, and a lot of this timeline isn't explained, literally in the show. It's more oblique. But there was global warming that led to a human exodus. So to replace the replicants were designed and built to do the jobs humans didn't want to do. And then to police them, you ended up with a special police force of Blade Runner units, which were also replicant humans. So global warming, exodus, replacement humans, replacement human police. Again, there's a logic and internal consistency to it. So if you don't work out your timeline or the history of your series, you're really going to struggle once you start getting into like books 2 or 3 and when things become more complicated. And a great and very sad example of this was the TV show Battlestar Galactica. I think Battlestar Galactica, like Game of Thrones, has really very quickly disappeared from fantasy and science fiction simply because they really screwed up the ending. And it makes it so people just don't want to watch the series again because you know what nonsense is coming. But at the start, there was an internal consistency to it in that humans developed robots. There was a robot war, a rebellion, because they were slaves, and then the robots leave. 50 years later, they come back as artificial humans or replicants, and those people are used as spies to go in and enable a second devastating attack on humanity. But then in the later seasons, it turns out that half of the replicant Cylons were actually angels and were 50,000 years old coming from Earth. Got very confusing. I don't know what the hell was going on or what they were thinking about. But the show really fell apart under the weight of nonsensical decisions and mixing science fiction and fantasy. So that's a real warning that don't bring magic into science fiction, but also really plot out where you're headed in the overall arc for your books. Okay, so how did I apply that to my work? So as I may have mentioned in the first video, I can't remember exactly. I wrote book two, This Automatic Eden, first, or the first half of it. And then I stopped and I had to start thinking a lot more carefully about the timeline of what I was doing. Once I realized I was writing a series, not a one-off book, I took a good 6 months out and I sat down and I wrote a 50,000 word outline from the year 2001 right through to 2055, where book one, The Paradise Factory, is set. That's a lot of work and a lot of time, but that's going to set me up now for hopefully for my entire career. Some of the notes per year were very simple. Here we can see in 2002, the FBI charged Frederick Takamatsu with the murder of Gillian Morrison. That won't make much sense to you now, but this comes into like a book three and book four. So my timeline was AI creates automation, automation creates mass unemployment creates nation state bankruptcy. And a consequence of countries going bankrupt is you get a mass segregation of society and the rise of organized crime. But the last two ones really could be in brackets. It's the first main one, nation state bankruptcy, which is the key point. So have your big idea and then work out a logical timeline up to the point where you're writing your books. Okay, and that's what I did. So I sat down, I worked this through, and then I started to get to a point of thinking about the world building in a bit more detail now, a bit less abstract. So in book two, the bit I'd paused at was where my protagonist, Alice Yu, an NYPD cop, goes to speak to the man who invented the world's first artificial intelligence. His name is Charles Takamatsu. And I had to write a scene where Alice is going to meet him, and if she's existing in a destitute, bankrupt New York, where the streets are lawless or ruled by organized gangs and organized crime, where would the 1% and the 1% of the 1% live? My first idea, again, you can see this awful sketch on the right-hand side, and I'm showing this again to say that you don't need to be an artist to think this through. This is something I just did on my iPad when I was on the subway. But my first thought was Takamatsu would be living in something like the Forbidden City, in that it would be a walled compound set in the middle of New York, and the exterior wall would be 100-foot tall, urine-stained concrete covered in graffiti, and the buildings on the inside would be kind of glittering golden palaces. But it just seemed to me like it was kind of limiting in its way. Are you going to have just one of these compounds in Manhattan? Manhattan isn't that big. Are you going to have five? You're going to have 10. And so I kind of ditched that idea after a few days. And then I did the sketch on the left-hand side. And this really helped unlock uh, the whole world of Cortex for me and what the future cities would be like. Now, on the right-hand side, you see a silhouette of six different buildings, and then the super tall one next to it. So the silhouettes are the currently or at the time the tallest buildings in the world. And the one second to the right is a Burj Khalifa, which is the world's tallest one now. And so I thought I'd double it. I'll go for a mile-high tower and make it so that only the upper portions of that tower are occupied. So you have that kind of open truss below it. And so you essentially, the 1% are moving up and creating a new city above the ruins of the old. Obviously, that would lead to the need for some sort of cheap aerial transport, but that's, we can deal with that in a few minutes. So using my architectural training, I modeled this out in 3D. Again, it was a way of exploring those kind of sketch ideas. And I don't think you obviously need to go into this level of detail if you're just writing stuff. But by doing this and by sitting down and kind of sketching out the actual buildings, it gave me many, many, many different ideas for future books and future novels, which I'm starting to write now. So even though I did this image maybe 5 years ago, I'm only just now writing scenes set inside this building. But because I did all that foundation work, I'm now set up for the long term. So this is the Empire State Building. Again, you can see it there next to the first blade tower. And you have the open truss at the base, and the higher up you go, a kind of glass facade starts to fill in the structural forms. And you get smaller kind of compounds or apartments low down, and then the upper, a few hundred floors are entirely dedicated to like one person or one individual person. Now, if you're building, I did this first. I did the compound, the Forbidden City sketch. Then I did the sketch you saw before, kind of the skyline one, and then I did this rendering. So that was just one tower. But if Alice is flying to this building to meet the inventor of AI, what's the actual city like? Now, obviously, there's a strong aesthetic. It started off in cyberpunk or things like Blade Runner, but now it's expanded out into these incredibly chaotic cities filled with neon signs and stuff like that. But to me, that felt a bit dated. Um, so this was the kind of a generic master plan I came up for the new Manhattan. You can see the red 2D lines of the existing island right now. And I basically thought if you're building a mile in the air, it doesn't really matter if your building's landing in the Hudson River or if it's landing on the island itself. So, the AI designing this just set up a relentless grid of these towers, set a few, 1,000 feet apart. And the 1% have basically built a new city for themselves above, the wastelands of the old one. Obviously, each tower would be different. Here they're all the same because I was just copying them through. But you can see again, starting off from that little sketch, that little idea, building up to this, was just a logical timeline of events happening. Now, as for designing the aerial car, the hoppers that the characters use to fly around with, again, it was a really fun thing to do. I knew that these were going to be part of the story, a bit like the ships in the Expanse. They would be featured because the characters would be using them a lot to travel around. But I also didn't want to lavish a huge amount of description on them. I wanted to do it bit by bit. And so to do that, I really needed to know how they smelled when they took off, whether it's like kind of oily, dirty, or whether it was like metallic or ozone, like whether they were hot or cold, their exhaust jets, how noisy they were, all those sort of things that involve the five senses of your characters and make something more realistic. Now, around this time when I was thinking about this, I was in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and I saw the amazing Bell helicopter there. Look at the photograph on the left. It's really beautiful. You have this very elemental form of the perspex bubble to the left, the truss shape, the truss behind it with the rotor blades on and the engine kind of expressed. And so I wanted to do something similar to that. Now, the idea being that the police cars are a lot more industrial and heavy and solid, like police cars we have now, where the 1% are driving around in Ferraris and Gordon Murray cars and stuff like that. So this sketch is really simple, as you can see, and I think you could potentially do a drawing like that and get enough detail from it to write about it. But I spent more time going through and drawing this because, drawing a flying car is a really fun thing to do. So the sketch to the left is pretty much like the Museum of Modern Art. You have the canopy at the front, the truss behind, and then kind of two circular engines. And then the one to the right is a bit more detailed now, where I'm thinking of the engines being kind of flat nozzles. I use ionic air propulsion through that. And then you have the police forward canopy with the lights on it, being an element kind of cradled by the truss on either side. So it's building up a series of components, which I then went through and modeled in 3D. I think as you can see from this is not a pretty vehicle. If someday I have the time to model like a future Ferrari, I can make something a lot more beautiful. This is intentionally crude, welded steel frames, a heavily finned nuclear reactor, fusion reactor to the rear. The canopy is kind of odd proportions, big and bulky with the lights on top. And I wanted it intentionally to be something that was not beautiful, but clearly an object of suppression, and also a way of expressing the brutality and the ugliness of the society that the characters are working in as well. And this was the first drawing that I did. I just took a hidden line and spent some time going through and just adding a lot of dirt and texture to the car. I think, again, it's a lived in universe, that kind of, phrase that we've heard a lot. But I really wanted the equipment my protagonist is in contact with to have a lot, a patina of age, to be old and battered, the batteries to not work properly, the heating elements to have failed. And those are sort of details that, for me, I wouldn't think about if I hadn't worked at design to this level of detail. But there are also the sort of things that give a real life to the world that your characters are inside. Another example is this drawing. I did it in Procreate on my iPad Pro, and I was just playing around with some of the new brushes that were in a release, and one of them gave me this kind of dappled um, dirt effect. So I'd put the dirt on the windshield of the car, and where the windscreen wipers have failed to clean it. And then I just literally thought about, well, if it's got dirty, what's it flying through? And it gave me the idea of like pollution storms, and that enabled me to do these kind of ochre and brown clouds around the car. Those, of course, have come from climate change, come from all the implications of things like you see in Blade Runner. And so that then gave me the idea of making pollution and storms a real feature in the books. And that, when you see certain storms coming, you have to get indoors because the rain, could be lethal. And I wouldn't have had that idea if I hadn't been drawing and fooling around and sketching out different parts of the world. Again, you don't need to do it to the level of this drawing, but it's something that, again, keeping a sketchbook, doodling away, will really help your subconscious think through complications in your stories. And the final image of this section is showing, again, it's the same model, but I've just rotated the rear engines, vertically to, lift the car up, and then you see it's got like riot cannons on the side, because these cars hover above crowds of protesters, and then if they get the orders, they suppress them with extreme prejudice. Okay, so that's the second rule. Have a big idea and then plot out a logical timeline from that big idea out and up to where your characters are. And that timeline can really take a lot of time to do and a lot of time to work through. But that is the absolute foundation of all the world building you could do. And you'd be amazed to think that you'll find something will come to you like on the year 10, and you'll say that there was a tsunami or an earthquake here, or there was a cartel war in Latin America. And that'll just pop into your head, and you make that a note, and you will eventually refer back to that or write whole novels about it in 5 years' time. So it's really worth putting that time in at the start. Okay, I am now going to shut this recording off, and I'll be back in soon with the third video. Thank you.